Hello and welcome to Echoes of a Bell Jar, the podcast where we delve into the lives of the artists who shaped our world, often at a tremendous personal cost. I'm your host, Alexa.
And I'm Sam. Today, we're discussing a writer whose name has become almost synonymous with confessional poetry, brilliant talent, and tragic despair, Sylvia Plath.
It's a name that carries immense weight. For some, she is a feminist icon, a visionary who gave voice to the silent anguish of women. For others, she is a case study in mental illness, her story defined by her relationship with the poet Terrifies and her eventual suicide.
But as we'll explore today, Sylvia Plath was all of these things, and none of them. She was a collection of fierce contradictions, a woman who desperately wanted a perfect domestic life and a towering, immortal literary career. A writer who produced some of the most searing, vibrant poetry of the 20th century while navigating profound inner darkness.
The central image of Plath is often that final one, a young woman in a London flat in the brutal winter of 1963, carefully sealing the kitchen door with wet towels and cloths to protect the children from the gas, opening the oven, and laying her head inside. It's an image that has overshadowed much of her work, but it's also an image that begs the question, what led her to that point? What was the dissonance between the public success and the private collapse?
Over the next hour, we're going to trace the arc of Sylvia Plath's life, from her idyllic but fraught childhood, through her academic triumphs and devastating mental breakdowns, to her passionate, destructive marriage, and finally, to her final, prolific burst of creativity, and her death. We'll also look at the complex and controversial legacy she left behind, a legacy that is still being fought over today.
So, let's begin at what for any life feels like the end, the winter of 1963. Part 1, The Tragic End, A Life in Contradiction.
It was February 11th, 1963, in London, one of the coldest winters in decades. The city was frozen, gripped by a flu epidemic. In a small flat at 23 Fitzroy Road in Primrose Hill, Sylvia Plath was alone with her two young children, Frida, not yet 3, and Nicholas, just 1 year old.
By all accounts, the preceding months had been a roller coaster. The previous summer, she had discovered her husband, the poet Ted Hughes, was having an affair with another woman. The betrayal was catastrophic. There was a violent confrontation, and Hughes left. Plath was devastated, but she was also, in a strange way, liberated. She moved with the children to this London flat, which had a poignant connection. It was once the home of the Irish poet W.B. Yeats, a sign she saw as a good omen.
And in this new space, she began to write. And she wrote like she was on fire. As her friend, the poet A. Alvarez, would later describe it, she was writing almost a poem a day, these incredible, explosive, visionary poems that would later be collected as Ariel. They were poems of rage, of freedom, of mythic pain. They were, in many ways, her phoenix-like attempt to rise from the ashes of her marriage.
But the practical realities were crushing. She was a single mother in an unheated flat during a brutal winter, with little money and the weight of caring for 2 infants. The creative euphoria was punctuated by deep troughs of despair. She was clinically depressed, and the darkness that had haunted her since adolescence was closing in.
On February 11th, she took meticulous, heartbreaking steps. She went into the room where her children were sleeping and left them a plate of bread and butter and 2 mugs of milk. She then went back to the kitchen, sealed the doorframe and window with wet towels and cloths to protect the children from the gas, opened the oven, and laid her head inside.
It was a methodical act. The care for her children, ensuring they had food and would be safe from the gas, speaks to a complex state of mind. It wasn't an act of abandonment in a fit of rage. It was, in her tormented logic, a solution. She believed they would be better off without her. Her au pair, arriving for work that morning, found Plath dead. The children were safe, physically unharmed.
The news sent shockwaves through the literary world. Sylvia Plath was already known, a respected poet, a promising novelist with The Bell Jar published just weeks before under a pseudonym. But this death, the circumstances of it, transformed her from a writer into a legend and a martyr. And it's this image, this final desperate act, that has defined her for so many. But as we'll see, to understand this end, we have to go back to the beginning, to the first great loss of her life, which would become the foundational trauma she would spend her entire life and career trying to articulate.
Part 2. Early Life and the Shadow of the Father.
Sylvia Plath was born on October 27, 1932, in Boston, Massachusetts. Her mother, Ariel Plath, was a first-generation American of Austrian descent, and her father, Otto Emil Plath, was a German immigrant, a brilliant and imposing man, an entomologist and a professor of biology at Boston University.
The relationship with her father is the bedrock of the Plath mythology, largely because she made it so in her work. In her early years, it seems to have been a classic case of hero worship. Otto was this towering intellectual figure, an expert on bees. In her journals and later in her poetry, she depicts a man she both adored and feared.
There's a famous photograph of Sylvia as a young child with her father. She's looking up at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated admiration. He was her world. But that world was shattered when she was just 8 years old. Otto Plath died on November 5th, 1940, from complications of diabetes.
Part 3. The Girl Who Wanted to Be God. Success and the First Crack. In 1950, Sylvia Plath arrived at Smith College on a scholarship, the epitome of the all-American golden girl. She was beautiful, brilliant, and ferociously ambitious. In her journals, she wrote about her desire to experience everything, to be a writer, a wife, a mother, an intellectual, to, in her own words, be God.
The pressure she put on herself was immense. She maintained a blistering pace, writing for magazines, winning prizes, getting straight A's. She was living the life that was expected of a woman of her era, but she was also yearning for something more, something transcendent. This conflict between societal expectation and her own vast ambition was a constant source of tension.
And then, in the summer of 1953, it all came crashing down. She had won a coveted guest editorship at Mademoiselle magazine in New York City. It should have been the pinnacle of her success. But the month in Manhattan was a disaster. She felt like a fraud, alienated by the glamorous, superficial world of the magazine. She was exhausted and the facade began to crack.
When she returned home to Wellesley, the depression that had been simmering for years descended upon her with full force. She was unable to read, to write, to sleep. She felt trapped, suffocated by the options available to her, the limited paths for a woman in the 1950s. She underwent electroconvulsive therapy, a brutal and primitive treatment at the time, which only deepened her sense of terror and helplessness.
On August 24, 1953, she went down into the crawl space of her family's home, took a bottle of sleeping pills, and hid herself there. She left a note saying she had gone for a long walk. It was a serious, determined attempt to end her life. She was missing for 3 days before her brother, Warren, found her alive but critically ill. This event, which would form the core of her semi-autobiographical novel, The Bell Jar, was a watershed moment. It was her first major confrontation with what she called the bell jar, the suffocating, airless jar of depression that could descend at any time, distorting the world and separating her from it.
Her recovery was long and difficult. She spent several months at McLean Hospital, where she received more enlightened psychiatric care, including therapy and, ironically, more ECT, but this time it was administered more humanely and was reportedly helpful. This period of breakdown and recovery was crucial. It gave her the raw material for the bell jar, and it solidified her understanding of herself as someone who had to navigate this cyclical darkness.
And it's here we see a pattern that would repeat itself. A period of intense striving and success, followed by a catastrophic collapse, followed by a period of recovery and even more intense creativity. She returned to Smith, graduated summa cum laude, and won a Fulbright scholarship to Newham College, Cambridge. It was there, in England, that her life would take its most fateful turn.
Part 4. And by the way, I have also fallen in love. Ted Hughes. February 25th, 1956. A party at Cambridge. Sylvia Plath, the vibrant American Fulbright scholar, is there. And so is Ted Hughes, a brooding, powerful, already legendary figure among the Cambridge poetry scene. The story of their meeting is the stuff of literary legend.
As Plath herself recounted in her journal, she had read some of Hughes's poems and was deeply impressed. At the party, they met, they danced, and then, in a fit of passionate intensity, he kissed her and she bit him on the cheek, drawing blood. It was a moment of raw, almost animalistic connection. She wrote to her mother just days later, "And by the way, I have also fallen in love. The only man I've met yet who is stronger than I am." For Plath, this was everything. Hughes represented a force of nature, a creative equal, a man who could match her own fierce intelligence and passion. They were married just 4 months later, in June of 1956.
The early years of their marriage were intensely collaborative and productive. They read each other's work, critiqued it, encouraged each other. They were in many ways the golden couple of poetry. They lived in both the US and the UK, teaching, writing, and immersing themselves in the literary world. Plath's first collection, The Colossus, was published during this time, and while it was well received, it still had a formal, controlled quality to it.
But even in this period of happiness, the old shadows lingered. Plath struggled with the demands of domesticity, with supporting Hughes's career while trying to nurture her own. She had 2 miscarriages, which were devastating, and then in 1960, their first child, Frida, was born. Motherhood brought her immense joy, but also new layers of exhaustion and responsibility. The crack in the ideal appeared in 1962. They had moved to a small house in Devon in the English countryside. Plath was pregnant with their second child, Nicholas. It was here that she discovered Hughes was having an affair with a Canadian poet and mutual acquaintance, Asha Wevel.
The discovery was apocalyptic. In her journal, she describes the moment with searing clarity. It was in many ways a reenactment of her father's abandonment. The towering, godlike man that she had devoted herself to had betrayed her. The foundation of her world, which she had built so carefully with him, shattered. The confrontation was violent. Plath reportedly tore handfuls of hair from Hughes's head and destroyed a desk of his work. Hughes left. Plath, now with a newborn and a toddler, was alone in the Devonshire winter. It was the ultimate rejection, and it plunged her into the deepest depression of her life. But as with the breakdown after her Mademoiselle summer, it also unleashed something in her.
The pain was unbearable, but it was also a catalyst. It was as if the formal, controlled voice of the Colossus had been blasted away, and what was left was a raw, incandescent, and utterly unique poetic voice. The voice of Ariel.
Part 5. The Ariel Poems, A Phoenix in Winter. After Hughes left, Plath moved back to London, to the flat at 23 Fitzroy Road. It was here, in the autumn and winter of 1962, that she entered the most creatively fertile period of her life. She would wake before dawn, in the blue hour, and write, sometimes finishing a poem before her children woke up.
These poems, written in a white heat, are unlike anything she had written before. They are stripped bare, mythic, furious, and ecstatic. They deal directly with her pain, her rage at Hughes's, her grief for her father, and a burning desire for rebirth. Let's listen to a bit of one of the most famous, Lady Lazarus.
I have done it again. 1 year in every 10 I manage it. a sort of walking miracle, my skin bright as a Nazi lampshade, my right foot a paperweight, my face a featureless, fine Jew linen. Peel off the napkin, O my enemy. Do I terrify?
The voice in that poem is terrifying and powerful. It's the voice of someone who has survived multiple suicide attempts and has turned that survival into a kind of vengeful art form. Dying is an art like everything else, she writes. I do it exceptionally well. It's shocking, blackly comic, and utterly compelling.
And then there's Dadi, the poem that perhaps more than any other has defined a legacy. It's a brutal, conflated portrait of her father and her husband. She uses the imagery of the Holocaust to express the enormity of her personal pain, a controversial choice that has been debated for decades. You do not do any more black shoe, in which I have lived like a foot for 30 years, poor and white, barely daring to breathe or aught chew. Daddy, I have had to kill you. You died before I had time. Marble heavy, a bag full of God, ghastly statue with one gray toe, big as a Frisco seal.
The poem is an exorcism. She is trying to kill the ghost of her father, which has fused with the living betrayal of her husband. It ends with a line that feels both triumphant and devastating. Daddy, daddy, you bastard, I'm through. This was the voice of Ariel. It wasn't a voice of passive suffering. It was a voice of active, furious confrontation. She was channeling her agony into art of the highest order. In her journal, she wrote about these poems with a sense of triumph. She knew they were her best work. She had a vision for the collection, a narrative arc that began with the word love and ended with the word spring, a journey towards rebirth.
But the creative euphoria was not enough to ward off the practical and psychological realities of her life. The winter was brutal. She was ill, deeply depressed, and struggling to care for 2 small children alone. The poems of Ariel were her phoenix cry, but in the cold reality of that London flat, the phoenix was struggling to rise from the ashes.
Part 6. The Final Days and the Unanswerable Question. So, we return to February 1963. A period of white-hot creativity had passed. The poems were written. A novel, The Bell Jar, had been published in the UK under the pseudonym Victoria Lucas to lukewarm reviews. She was alone, sick, and the depression had returned with a vengeance.
Her friend, A. Alvarez, saw her a few days before her death. He later wrote that she seemed calm, too calm. It was the calm of someone who had made a decision. She had tried to see a doctor but couldn't get an appointment. The system, in a sense, had failed her.
On the night of February 10th, she went to a neighbor's flat to make a phone call. She seemed distressed. Later that night, she wrote a note with a doctor's phone number and the words, "Please call Dr. Horder." She left it where it could be found. It was her final, unanswered call for help.
And then, on the morning of the 11th, she carried out the plan we described at the beginning. The meticulous care for her children, the sealing of the kitchen, the final act. It was, in a horrific way, the ultimate expression of the duality that had defined her life, the loving, responsible mother and the tormented, suicidal self.
Why did she do it? There's no single answer. It was the culmination of a lifetime of factors. A genetic predisposition to depression, the profound early trauma of her father's death, the crushing pressure of her own ambitions, the societal constraints on women, the betrayal by her husband, the isolation of single motherhood, the physical exhaustion and illness, and the failure of her support system at a critical moment.
It was a perfect storm of internal and external forces. The brilliant, burning creativity that produced Ariel seemed to have consumed the last of her resources. She had poured everything into the work, and there was nothing left to keep her going.
Part 7.
Legacy and Controversy. The Battle for Sylvia Plath. Sylvia Plath was dead, but the story of Sylvia Plath was just beginning. And the primary author of that story for the next 35 years would be the man whose actions had precipitated her final despair, Ted Hughes.
Hughes became the literary executor of her estate. He controlled her unpublished manuscripts, her journals, and the rights to her published work. His first act was to assemble the Ariel collection for publication, but he made significant changes to Plath's own intended vision.
Plath's Ariel was a narrative of rage and rebirth. It was supposed to start with the word love and end with the word spring. Hughes removed what he considered the more personally aggressive poems, many of which were directly about him and his affair, and he reordered the collection, ending it with the poems she had written in the last weeks of her life, which are much more resigned and despairing. He effectively changed the story from one of furious survival to one of tragic defeat.
This was seen by many, particularly by the rising feminist movement, as an act of profound censorship. They saw Hughes as the patriarchal villain, silencing Plath's true voice even after her death, controlling her narrative to protect his own reputation.
The controversy exploded with the publication of The Bell Jar under her own name in the U.S. in 1971. The novel became a feminist classic, a searing indictment of the feminine mystique of the 1950s. Plath was adopted as a martyr, a symbol of the brilliant woman destroyed by a patriarchal society and a treacherous husband. Hughes, for decades, remained silent, bearing the brunt of public hatred. He was vilified, even physically attacked at poetry readings. The narrative was set. Ted Hughes, the beast, had destroyed the fragile, brilliant Sylvia.
But the story is, of course, more complicated than that. In 1998, the year before his own death from cancer, Hughes published Birthday Letters, a collection of poems he had written to Plath over the decades, addressing their relationship, her death, and his own guilt and grief. It was his one and only public attempt to tell his side of the story. Dramatic reading. Sam, from Hughes's The Minotaur.
The bloody end of the skein that unraveled your marriage left your children echoing like tunnels in a labyrinth. I was the Minotaur, I suppose, but I was also Theseus. And I was the labyrinth, and I was you. We were each other.
Birthday Letters was a monumental success and complicated the public perception. It presented Hughes not as a monster, but as a man grappling with the impossible force of Plath's genius and her mental illness, a man who felt he had failed her.
The battle over Plath's legacy continues to this day. Was she a victim of Hughes? Or was he, in his own way, also a victim of her myth? The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the messy, painful middle. The censorship of her work was a profound ethical violation. But Hughes also dedicated his life to promoting her poetry, ensuring its publication and its place in the literary canon.
And the legacy is further complicated by other tragedies. In 1969, Asia Wevel, Hughes's lover for whom he left Plath, killed herself in almost an identical manner, also killing the 4-year-old daughter she had with Hughes, Shura. It was a horrifying echo that deepened the sense of a cursed narrative.
The fight over Plath's voice, her story, and her memory reflects the immense power she still holds. She's not a settled figure in history. She is a live wire, a catalyst for debates about art, mental health, feminism, and the ethics of biography.
So what are we left with 60 years after her death? We are left with the work, the brilliant, terrifying, and beautiful work. The poems of Ariel have not faded. They have only grown more powerful.
Sylvia Plath gave us a language for despair that did not exist before. She took the private, often shameful experience of mental illness, particularly female mental illness, and she made it public, mythic, and artistically valid. She refused to look away from the darkness, and in doing so, she made countless readers feel less alone in their own.
Her life story is a tragedy, but it is not solely a tragedy. It is also a story of immense courage, of a relentless drive to create, to understand, to articulate the most difficult parts of the human experience. She fought her demons with the only weapon she had, her words.
The two Sylvias, the golden girl and the tormented poet, were never truly separate. They were in a constant, painful, and productive dialogue. The same sensitivity that made her vulnerable to despair was the very source of her extraordinary artistic vision.
For those of you listening who are inspired or perhaps haunted by her story, the next step is to engage with her work directly. Read Ariel, read The Bell Jar, read her journals, experience the raw power of her voice for yourself. And as you do, reflect on the ongoing conversations about mental health, about the challenges faced by artists, particularly female artists, and about who gets to control the story after the storyteller is gone.
Sylvia Plath once wrote, "I want to write because I have the urge to excel in one medium of translation and expression of life. I can't be satisfied with the colossal job of merely living." In the end, despite the pain, she achieved that excellence she so fiercely desired. She translated her life into art, and in doing so, she achieved the immortality she so fiercely desired.